8th edition was a major shift for Magic the Gathering, introducing several templating changes and the like. Beyond the changes to the core rules and design, also came with it the beginning of the modern era Magic, as this is the first set legal in the modern format. In the years since, Magic has only kept changing, leaving some cards left behind by comparison. Today, we'll look at some of the more powerful cards from the pre-modern era Magic the Gathering, and why they're not as good as they once were. And at number 10, we have Grim Lavamancer. This human wizard costs 1 red mana and has 1 power and toughness. You may pay 1 red mana, tap Grim Lavamancer and exile 2 cards from your graveyard to deal 2 damage to any target. Grim Lavamancer was a mainstay in aggressive strategies since its printing and torment. A mainstay of any red aggro deck is in its density of cheap threats, and often just as cheap burn spells. Many of red's best cards would come down quick, but leave just as quickly. Sometimes your early threats would just die, and sometimes you'd expend a spell like Incinerate attempting to protect it. Regardless, red decks quickly fill the graveyard, but rarely have anything to do with it. Burn decks want to kill your opponent as quickly as possible, and don't have the mana or time to spend messing around in the graveyard. This is where Grim Lavamancer finds its niche as an efficient and on-theme option to make proper use of the grave as a resource. Its low cost made it a natural fit into a deck that aimed to cast as many things for as little mana as possible. And from there, it would either demand removal or provide inevitability, as it converted useless cards in the graveyard into shocks to the face or any relevant creature with low enough toughness. Burn would not always draw those perfect hands with enough lightning bolts to mop your opponent up in a timely manner, and Grim Lavamancer helps smooth out those grindy matches as best as possible. Grim Lavamancer was so effective at this that it remained a facet of competitive burn even after Modern rose to prominence as a format. It only truly began to fall out of favor in the last few years as burn decks grew more and more efficient. Instead of a slow, repeatable ping effect, burn decks could now play a hasty threat like Monastery Swiftspear that made for a much more imposing clock. Beyond that, the density of efficient burn spells only grew over time, with more and more cards like Skewer the Critics providing paths to efficient burn wins. Simply put, Burn's just a bit too fast to reliably need or even really want Grim Lavamancer. However, compared to most other pre-modern retirees, Grim Lavamancer remained playable for a lot longer than most cards on this list. This is part of why it's only number 10 on the list, as some players who've kept up with the modern metagame in the last few years might be surprised to hear the card has lost its spot in the deck at all. And at number 9, we have Phyrexian Negator. This Phyrexian horror costs 2 generic and 1 black mana and has 5 power and toughness. It also has the keyword Trample, which allows to deal any excess damage it would have done to a blocker to its controller. However, whenever Phyrexian Negator is dealt damage, you sacrifice that many permanents. This double-edged sword provided the backbone of black aggro given its impressive stat line, especially for the time. While you certainly put yourself at risk of losing permanents to straight damage, in return you got a powerful beatstick. Even if you were forced to sacrifice your lands to the ability, as long as you were still applying pressure, that was the important part. The deck doubled down on this self-sacrifice with the aid of Phyrexian Skuta, which could enter with 2+1/+1 counters if you paid an extra cost of 3 life when casting it. What really put these creatures ahead and made their downsides all the more palatable was the easy access to Dark Ritual in non-standard formats to turbo out these creatures as early as the first turn. Use of fast mana also helped make up for the drawback of sacrificing permanents, since you'd still get bursts of mana to deploy follow-up threats. This card was once considered so powerful that a reimagined version in Phyrexian Obliterator costs 4 black mana for essentially the same card. Of course, while a 3 or even 4 mana 5/5 with Trample is impressive, contemporary Magic has seen plenty of creatures with impressive stat lines with far less downsides. For 2 generic and 2 black, you could instead play Sheoldred the Apocalypse, who has a similar body but only upsides, and very powerful ones at that. While Sheoldred is something of an extreme example, the fact remains that we've long since moved past the days of this sort of stat line needing a drawback, which in turn leaves Phyrexian Negator feeling downright obsolete when compared to other options. Modern Magic is fast enough that even if cards like Sheoldred didn't exist, it'd be tough to ask people trying to resolve a Phyrexian Negator against a Hammer Time opponent, and feel all that confident. Premodern was generally slow enough that a card like Phyrexian Negator could feel genuinely disruptive and potent, without feeling like you're throwing away your entire game and playing it. And at number 8, we have Wild Mongrel. This dog costs 1 generic and 1 green mana and has 2 power and toughness. You can discard a card at any time to give Wild Mongrel +1 power and toughness and make it become any color of your choice until the end of turn. Pre-modern Magic is defined by a general lack of efficiency when it comes to threats, with most good attackers coming with some form of downside or high mana cost. Wild Mongrel is no different in that while it can be a powerful attacker, it requires you to invest cards from your hand to use. Savvy players quickly found that there were several cards that directly benefited from being discarded, such as Basking Rootwalla. Rudwalla is far from exciting as a 1-mana 1/1 with a pump-up ability that you can only use once a turn, but it has the ability Madness, which allows you to cast a spell while you are discarding it. Basking Rootwalla's Madness cost is 0, meaning if you discard a Basking Rootwalla to Wild Mongrel, you'll both buff your Mongrel and get to cast Basking Rootwalla for free. Blue-Green Madness proved a potent option in 2002 Standard, where the deck was overloaded with targets to bin into the graveyard, such as Wonder, which gives flying to every creature you control whenever it's in the graveyard and you control an island. Wild Mongrel wasn't just limited to dedicated discard strategies to be effective. Aggressive decks often do not need many lands to function, and any lands drawn past the first few turns are borderline dead draws. Wild Mongrel was able to convert those lands into some manner of value, and thus slotted into the curves of many aggressive green decks of the era. While there are no shortages of cards that benefit from being in the graveyard these days, it's generally better practice to try and avoid options like Wild Mongrel that offer outright card disadvantage. Faithful Mending and its slightly more illegal older brother are just a few of the copious options to get cards in the bin and refill your hand while doing so. Wild Mongrel was ahead of its time in terms of performing work as an outlet, engine, and a threat all at once, yet getting ahead early only meant it felt all the more outdated once the rest of the card design caught up with it. And these days, the means by which you pull off graveyard and discard synergies are infinitely more threatening. And at number 7, we have Sutured Ghoul. This zombie costs 4 generic and 3 black mana and has trample. As it enters the battlefield, you may exile any number of creature cards from your graveyard, and Sutured Ghoul's power and toughness becomes equal to the total power and toughness of all exiled cards, respectively. So, if you exile creatures with a combined total of 10 power and 14 toughness, you'll create an 11/14 zombie with trample. The goal of Sutured Ghoul decks was to fill your graveyard with as many large creature power as you could to make for one giant ghoul. The most efficient way to do this was via Hermit Druid, which can be tapped to reveal cards on top of your library until you reveal a basic land. That land goes into your hand, and the other cards all go to the graveyard. Typically, you just play one single basic land, then mill most of your deck in one go, and any cards you miss could be milled the next time you activated Hermit Druid, since you'd be guaranteed to have no basics to find. Sutured Ghoul decks would be able to run a mountain as the one basic land, so they could play it to satisfy the condition of anger to give creatures haste while it itself is in the graveyard. This synergy allowed you to mill all your fatties and give the ghoul haste, allowing it to attack the turn you summoned it, and hopefully kill your opponent out of nowhere. Hopefully is the key word there, of course, since this is a 7-mana creature with no protection, meaning that any hard removal spell would end it. While Hermit Druid remains an immensely powerful card, it's more often just used to win on the spot alongside Thassa's Oracle or the like. And when it comes to arbitrarily large creatures relegated to the graveyard, Lord of Extinction is more efficient and can scale throughout the game, and is also unplayable in contemporary Magic. Sutured Ghoul was, like many pre-modern cards, a sign of the growing power and complexity of Magic, as a game where such decks could exist and compete. But it itself is far from an exciting prospect to actually play with today, since it's a graveyard payoff that forces you to empty your graveyard of your other targets, absolutely hamstringing any follow-up plays, especially if that follow-up is a second copy of Sutured Ghoul. And at number 6, we have Phyrexian Processor. This artifact costs 4 generic mana and allows you to pay any amount of life as it enters the battlefield. You may pay up to 4 mana and tap Phyrexian Processor to create a Phyrexian minion creature token with power and toughness equal to the amount of life you paid when Processor entered the battlefield. Essentially, by paying a chunk of your life up front, you have a repeatable army and a can effect that can pump out substantially sized threats every turn. This card first saw prominence in standard format where it won Worlds in 2000 in a Tinker deck. Tinker is one of the most broken cards ever printed, allowing you to sacrifice any artifact to search your library for any artifact and put it onto the battlefield. This could not only cheat out Phyrexian Processor itself, but also far more likely to grab a copy of Crumbling Sanctuary, which replaced damage with exiling that many cards on top of the player's library instead. This helped offset the life cost of Phyrexian Processor by insulating you from outright dying as you built your army of minions. This was a time in Magic where Tinker was greatly limited in its targets that it could cheat out. Today, resolving a Tinker often can win the game on the spot if your deck is constructed properly, but back then it was a whole different story. And as such, Phyrexian Processor and this cute synergy do not translate well to our more current day sensibilities. For one, it takes 8 mana total to cast and then activate the Processor, making for quite the investment if you want your token right away. And if you don't wait and just cast Phyrexian Processor without using it right away, then your opponent may remove it on their turn and have essentially made you waste all that life. While Phyrexian Processor is not technically modern legal, it could be printed into the format tomorrow and cause little to no changes. Urza's Saga already provides a far more threatening source of creature token threats, and even more advantage on top of that, and all it costs is your land drop for a turn. Phyrexian Processor has aged with all the grace of milk when compared to other cards like Metalworker, that were also included into the World Championship winning deck list. And at number 5, we have Fires of Yavimaya. This enchantment costs 1 generic, 1 red, and 1 green mana, and gives all creatures you control haste, allowing them to attack and activate abilities without summoning sickness. You may sacrifice this card at any time to give target creature +2 power and toughness until end of turn. This highly aggressive enchantment was once a build-around card for aggressive decks. These fire decks aim to cast their namesake card as fast as possible off the back of Birds of Paradise and other mana dorks. From there, not only would Fires of Yavimaya make any future dorks hasty mana acceleration, it would more importantly allow for big pluses of damage as early as turn 3. Blastoderm would attack for 5 before your opponent even played their 3rd land if you were on the play, and would be almost completely immune to removal thanks to the ability Shroud. And while Blastoderm would die eventually thanks to fading, it often did a number on your opponent's health before doing so. Saproling Burst really lived up to its name in this deck, as you'd often remove 6 of its 7 fade counters right away to swing for 6 damage over as many bodies. All this maximum pace aggression even made Fires of Yavimaya's second effect relevant. Trading off your haste enabler for an extra bit of damage is fairly low impact in most situations, but that's because you're supposed to save sacrifice and help push an attack to lethal. Fires of Yavimaya aims to present multiple attackers every time it swings, making combat math difficult to manage for your opponent. If enough creatures slip through unblocked, the 2 extra damage from sacrificing fires would sometimes be just enough to close out the game. As time passed, red-green aggro decks found more and more options, particularly in the form of creatures that had inherent haste, or just helped push for damage more efficiently. Fires of Yavimaya represented some nice benefits, but required you to take a turn off from casting threats to properly use it. Ravnica Allegiance even saw a side grade to Fires of Yavimaya in the form of Rhythm of the Wild, which could either give a non-token creature a +1/+1 counter, or haste whenever said creature entered the battlefield. Rhythm of the Wild also makes your creatures outright uncounterable, and even then it only really amounted to some standard play and not much else. Fires of Yavimaya isn't an unreasonable card to consider in a deck by contemporary standards, proving far better than most cards on this list by modern scrutiny. But aggro options have just outpaced the need for effects like this, even at lower mana values such as this. And at number 4, we have Masticore. This artifact creature costs 4 generic mana and has 4 power and toughness, although you have to discard a card at the beginning of your upkeep every turn or sacrifice the Masticore. It has 2 activate abilities that both cost 2 generic mana. The first deals 1 damage to target creature, and the second regenerates Masticore. Regenerate is a defunct keyword mechanic that replaces the next time a creature would die with instead tapping it, removing all damage from it, and removing it from combat, essentially preventing the next time a creature would die. Given that pre-modern Magic was dominated by powerful non-creature spells and generally inefficient creatures, a 4/4 for 4 that could repeatedly protect itself for minimal mana investment was fairly ahead of the curve. It helped that Masticore also invalidated creatures with low enough toughness, clearing through most boards of X1s without even turning sideways. What really cemented Masticore's status as a pre-modern mainstay is the fact that it was an artifact. Any deck could run Masticore if it wanted to, leading to the card showing up in everything from dedicated artifact strategies like Tinker, to even showing up in decks that the card is naturally good against like Elves. While today, the repeated discard is quite the downside, back then, games were generally grindy enough that it was more of a manageable downside. Even if you did run out of cards to use, you could just pump all your mana into protecting Masticore and dealing damage with it. Over the years, this artifact has certainly rusted over some. Not even the sleek, trimmed-down, lesser Masticore can make a splash after its introduction via Modern Horizons. Masticore's efficient body protection don't feel especially efficient in the realm of contemporary creature design, with the 2-mana regenerate ability often coming across as more clunky than something like Ward. Masticore's best utility as an answer to 1 toughness creatures has also been overtaken by multiple cards over the years. Rendon 6 is a planeswalker able to ping and clear away mana dorks and small threats, albeit 1 in 2 colors and not entirely legal in every format. But we've also seen the likes of Orcish Bowmaster outright impede 1 toughness creatures from making a proper splash in the format at all. Masticore, like many cards of this list, was ahead of its time in terms of design space, but now pays for that by having been replaced by all the better things that entered the very same design space. And at number 3, we have Terravore. This Lurgoyf costs 1 generic and 2 green mana, and has power and toughness equal to the number of land cards in all graveyards. Unlike most cards in this list, Terravore did not see much competitive success in the original pre-modern era. Its first competitive event success came in the year 2007 in Legacy Life from the Loam decks. However, as pre-modern has been explored more and more as an alternative format by contemporary Magic players, it has become one of the all-stars of the format. Land destruction was far more common with stone raid effects in most sets, and even appeared in multiple colors. And since Terravore doesn't care about whose lands are in the graveyard, just the quantity, you were free to focus on removing your opponent's lands just as much as your own. Spells like Devastating Dreams were able to clear up multiple lands from both fields in one fell swoop. And that's to say nothing of mass land removal like the very legal Armageddon. Terravore provides a potent beat stick that scales both with your land destruction game plan, but also over the natural flow of the game as lands get discarded and the like. Terravore is such a worthy build around that some builds of Oath of the Druids run it as the primary, if not the only reanimation target. Oath of the Druids allows you to mill your deck until you hit a creature, as long as your opponent controls more creatures than you on your upkeep. By running a very low creature count, you can mill several lands in one go and then hit Terravore, which Oath of the Druids then puts onto the battlefield for free. Ranking Terravore is one of the more difficult cards for this list since it's a pre-modern powerhouse, but it wasn't exactly all that notable or renowned in the actual pre-modern time period. It was only after reevaluation of the card pools and tinkering with modern deck building in mind that Terravore graduated from just a casual level card. There's no doubting that Terravore is a mainstay pre-modern, with it sitting as about the 5th most played green card in the contemporary pre-modern format. However, its lack of historical success means it falls short of the top when compared to some of pre-modern's other greatest hits. And at number 2, we have Psychatog. This Psychatog costs 1 generic, 1 blue, and 1 black mana, and has 1 power and 2 toughness. You may discard a card to give Psychatog plus 1 power and toughness until the end of turn. You may also exile 2 cards from your graveyard to give Psychatog plus 1 power and toughness until end of turn. Psychatog is a riff off the Atog design space, where you give up something in exchange for temporarily buffing the Atog. Psychatog is perhaps the most historically relevant Atog ever printed, rivaled only by the original. Unlike most Atogs, Psychatog does not care about a specific card type to get its buff. Throwing away cards in hand for minimal buffs is hardly ideal in most stages of the game, but Psychatog was not a beat stick used for early to mid game. Psychatog for years was one of the premier control finishers. Blue-black control shells would constantly restock their hand throughout the game with Gush and other powerful draw spells. Each piece of removal or counterspell used to trade out an opponent's card would slowly fill the graveyard with more and more fodder to later spend. Some interactions even directly synergize with Psychatog's discard ability, like the Madness counterspell Circular Logic, that only costs 1 mana if you discarded it. Once you'd cleared your opponent's board and stripped them of resources, Psychatog could attack and exile your whole graveyard for a massive boost. If you're within range of lethal, there's no harm in discarding your hand away to get those last few points of damage and win the game off the back of a single good Psychatog swing. This was a prominent control strategy for years, only really fading as more and more powerful control win conditions that didn't even involve combat were printed. Psychatog itself is not modern legal, although Modern Horizons 3 introduces Psychic Frog as a clear homage to the classic control finisher. Even if Psychatog itself were introduced back into Modern proper, it's unlikely it would actually see any substantial play. These days, control decks have plenty of ways to use their graveyard, such as paying the delve cost on a creature like Murktide Regent. Psychatog is good for pushing for lethal, but it only really can make for one impressive swing before becoming functionally useless. Meanwhile, Murktide Regent eats less cards from the graveyard and becomes a scary threat that will only grow stronger the longer it's in play, which is opposite of what Psychatog brings to the table. Regardless, it's still one of the most iconic control cards ever printed, and one of the most important threats to be mindful of in pre-modern. And at number 1, we have Sivvi, Defiant Hero. This legendary human rebel costs 1 generic and 2 white mana, and has 1 power and 3 toughness. You may pay X generic mana and tap Sivvi to search your library for a rebel with a mana value of X or less and put it onto the battlefield. Her second ability allows you to pay 3 generic mana at any time to put a rebel card in your graveyard on the bottom of your library. Sivvi was the glue that held the rebel strategy popularized in Standard in the year 2000. Rebels were fairly unimpressive creatures even by pre-modern standards, usually just small bodies that could only pay mana and tap themselves to search for a rebel of a certain size. In practice, however, this made the rebels an engine of creatures that all found each other that could notably be activated at instant speed. This allowed you to play on your opponent's turn essentially, especially if you were on a build that splashed blue for counterspells. What you do is you'd pass your turn without playing anything, then wait to counter whatever plays your opponent may have had. If your opponent didn't play anything worth countering, you could instead activate your rebel abilities to search for more and apply more of a clock. Sivvi was far and away the most important rebel to find, considering her mana sync ability allowed you to find any other rebel in the deck. She also could rebuy any rebels that died in combat and search them right back out, meaning the higher cost rebels like Ramoshian Sky Marshal could be run at lower densities and still be consistently accessed. The old legendary rule also worked in a way that only one copy of a legendary could exist on the board, no matter who controlled it. This meant in mirror matches, not only was Sivvi the most important card for your own deck, it doubled as a kill spell for your opponent's Sivvi if they played it first. It didn't help that Mercadian Mask also introduced the powerful land Rishadan Port. which allowed these rebel control decks even more ability to deny your opponent access to colors and slow the game down even more in their favor. Both Lin Sivvi and Rishadan Port were both banned from mass block constructed format in 2000, in part thanks to their dominance and unfun play patterns. However, while Rishadan Port remains one of the best lands in Legacy format, Lin Sivvi herself has been relegated to a novelty in the Commander format. There are simply much better uses for your mana, even if you want to deploy your threats entirely on your opponent's turn. However, Lin Sivvi's impact on the world of Premodern cannot be understated, with an unassuming white card turning white weenies into a genuine meta threat, even in builds that didn't splash blue counterspells. Given that she was so prominent then and so underwhelming now, there's no better pick to round out a list at the top of Premodern cards that no longer makes the cut. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any other cards you feel were worth an inclusion? Any other topics you'd like to see us discuss? If so, let us know down in the comments below.